welcome. You've arrived at a quiet place where stories from the ancient world come to life. Tonight, I invite you to close your eyes, slow your breath, and listen. Let your imagination carry you back through time to a land of myths, empires, and forgotten voices. This is the story of ancient Rome, from its legendary birth to its fall, and the echoes it left behind. Let me take you back, far beyond the marble columns and golden eagles. Before Rome was Rome, before roads stretched to the ends of the world, there was only wilderness. Hills rose gently from the banks of the river Tiber. Oak trees whispered in the breeze. Wolves roamed free, and humans lived in scattered tribes. In this ancient land, a story begins, not of emperors or armies, but of two infants floating in a basket. Their names were Romulus and Remus. They were born to Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin, and, according to legend, the god Mars, the god of war. But their birth was dangerous. Their grandfather had been dethroned by a cruel king named Amulius, who feared the boys might grow up to reclaim their rightful place. So he ordered them cast into the river. The Tiber, though wild in spring, carried them gently. And then, the miracle. A she-wolf, black-eyed, alert, came down to drink from the water. She saw the twins, heard their cries, and instead of attacking, she lay beside them. With warmth and milk, she gave them life. In the shade of the Palatine Hill, they grew, first like cubs, then like boys. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus took them in and raised them as his sons. Years passed. Romulus and Remus grew strong, leaders among other young men. When they learned their true origins, they overthrew King Amulius and restored their grandfather to power. But destiny had another path for them. The brothers decided to build a new city, not in Alba Longa, not in an old place, but here beside the river where the wolf had found them. But disagreement came. Which hill should be the heart of their city? Remus preferred the Aventine, Romulus the Palatine. They each stood atop their chosen hill and waited for a sign. Birds, sacred to the gods, were to decide. Remus saw 6 vultures. Romulus saw 12. They quarreled. The argument turned deadly. In the end, Romulus killed Remus. No one knows the true reason, pride, ambition, or fate, but the result was clear. Romulus became the sole founder of the new city. He named it Roma. He marked its walls with the plow, drawing sacred lines around what would become the beating heart of an empire. But it was not yet grand. In those first years, Rome was a humble place, mud huts and narrow paths, more village than city. To grow, it needed people. Romulus offered asylum. Exiles, fugitives, and wanderers came. But there were few women, and so the Romans invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival. During the celebration, Roman men seized Sabine women and carried them away. This act, though violent, led to peace. In time, the Sabines and Romans united, becoming one people. Romulus ruled for many years. Some say he vanished in a thunderstorm and became a god. Others say he was murdered by jealous senators. No one knows. But the city he built did not die. 7 kings ruled Rome after him, some wise, some cruel. The last was Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He ruled with iron and fear. When his son committed a terrible crime, the people rose. They cast out the monarchy and vowed never to serve a king again. And so, from myth and murder, from wolves and war, Rome was born. A city that would one day rule the world. But that began as a child's cry beside a river. Close your eyes and picture Rome again, still young, still raw. Its walls are not yet grand, its temples barely touched by time. Yet even in these early days, Rome is alive. Its people farm, trade, worship, and make war. It is a city shaping itself, and at its helm are kings, not emperors, not senators, but rulers of flesh and blood. According to tradition, Rome had 7 kings. Some ruled with wisdom, others with cruelty. Some built monuments, others brought war. But each one left a mark, like footsteps pressed deep into the wet earth of a rising empire. The first king, the founder, Romulus. You know his tale already: the wolf, the river, the fratricide. But Romulus was more than a myth. He gave Rome its first political structures, dividing the people into tribes, establishing the Senate, and creating an army. He ruled for nearly 4 decades before, as legend says, he vanished in a storm and was taken up to the heavens as the god Quirinus. His death left a vacuum and the city's first succession crisis. After Romulus, Rome turned to a man of peace, Numa Pompilius, a Sabine. He was reluctant to rule. He loved the gods, the land, the silence of thought. But the people called, and he answered. Numa brought religion to Rome, not myths, but structure. He established temples to Janus and Vesta, and taught the Romans that war was not the only path. He founded the office of the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. Under Numa, Rome knew peace, decades of it. But peace never lasts forever. Where Numa was gentle, Tullus Hostilius was fire. He reignited Rome's martial spirit. He waged war on Alba Longa, the city of Romulus's ancestors. The war, though brutal, was settled in a curious way. Instead of great armies clashing, 3 brothers from each city were chosen to fight. The Horatti for Rome and the Curiati for Alba Longa. A trial by combat. In the end, one Horatius remained standing. Rome triumphed. Tullus brought back discipline and expansion, but forgot the gods. His neglect of rituals, they say, brought lightning from the sky. One stormy night, his palace was struck, and he was consumed by flame. Next came Ancus Marcius, grandson of Numa, who sought balance, war and religion, sword and sanctuary. He fortified the Janiculum Hill, built the first prison, and established Ostia, Rome's first seaport. The Pons Sublicius, the first bridge over the Tiber, was his doing, linking Rome to its future. Ancus was a builder of society. He encouraged population growth, bringing Latins into Rome and expanding its identity. He ruled wisely and died peacefully. Now the monarchy began to shift. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was not Roman by birth. He came from Etruria, a rich, artistic northern land. But with ambition and wealth, he charmed the Roman people and was elected king. He doubled the Senate size and introduced Etruscan customs: purple robes, ivory thrones, golden circlets. He built the Circus Maximus, where chariots raced in thunderous loops, and began work on the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer. But power invites danger. He was assassinated by the sons of Ancus, who feared his growing influence. Yet the throne did not return to them. In the palace lived a boy, born a slave. Flames once danced around his sleeping head, and a queen saw in that fire a prophecy. His name was Servius Tullius, and he would become king. He rose not by war, but by merit. He married the king's daughter, and was later chosen to rule. Servius brought reform. He conducted the first census, dividing Romans into classes based on wealth. This gave structure to military and political life. He expanded the city, built the Servian Wall, and gave Rome the shape it would carry into the Republic. But betrayal came from within his own home. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He was the son or grandson of Priscus and seized power by murdering Servius in the street. He ruled without Senate approval, without consent. He ruled by fear. Under him, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus was completed, vast and gleaming atop the Capitoline Hill. But his works were overshadowed by his cruelty. He silenced opposition, exiled nobles, and filled Rome with dread. But it was not his own violence that ended the monarchy. It was his son's. Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, committed an unspeakable act. He violated a noble woman named Lucretia, known for her virtue. When she revealed the crime to her family, she took her own life, asking for justice. Her death lit a fire in the hearts of the Roman people. Lucius Junius Brutus, a nobleman once thought foolish, stood tall. He led a rebellion, calling for an end to kings forever. The people rose. Tarquin and his sons were exiled. In 509 BC, the monarchy ended, In its place, a new system was born, the Roman Republic, a government without kings, a state ruled by elected consuls and guided by the Senate. It was not perfect nor peaceful, but it was Rome's next chapter, a bold experiment that would last for centuries. The age of kings was over, but their shadows lingered. Rome would never forget them, their virtues, their sins, their temples, their wars. And though their names faded from common speech, their echoes shaped every law, every building, every choice that followed. As the city moved into a new age, one truth remained. Rome was no longer a kingdom. It was becoming something greater. The kings were gone. The cries of the people still echoed from the Capitoline. The streets whispered of change. It was the year 509 BC. Rome stood on the threshold of a new experiment, one without thrones, without crowns. A city governed not by one man, but by many. A res publica, a public thing, a republic. With the monarchy overthrown, two new leaders were chosen. They were called consuls, not kings, but magistrates, elected by the people, serving together for 1 year. Their power was equal, and either could veto the other. It was a delicate balance. The first two consuls were Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who led the revolt against the last king, and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, husband of Lucretia. But Collatinus was still a Tarquin, and Rome wanted no memory of that name. He resigned, and others followed. The Republic would not tolerate even the shadow of tyranny. The Senate, once an advisory body under the kings, now rose in prominence. Senators were not elected by the people, but chosen for life. Elders, landowners, former magistrates. They debated laws, guided foreign policy, and held the Republic's memory. They did not rule Rome directly, but they steered its course like the hand behind the tiller of a vast ship. And in the Republic's early years, the Senate helped Rome survive storms. The exiled king, Tarquinius Superbus, did not fade quietly. He sought allies, stirred wars, and tried to reclaim his throne. Rome was attacked by nearby cities, including Clusium, led by the Etruscan general Lars Porsena. Legend tells of a hero, Horatius Cocles, who held a bridge against the enemy, standing alone while others dismantled it behind him. He leapt into the Tiber and swam to safety, wounded but triumphant. Other tales speak of Mucius Scaevola, who infiltrated enemy lines, failed to assassinate the king, and to show Roman resolve, placed his hand in a fire and let it burn. Even his enemies were awed. These may be myths, but they carried truth in spirit. The Republic would not kneel. Rome, though free from kings, was not yet free for all. Society was divided. On one side stood the patricians, wealthy aristocrats who controlled land, law, and politics. On the other stood the plebeians, farmers, craftsmen, laborers, who fought in Rome's wars but had little voice at home. This division gave rise to decades of struggle known as the Conflict of the Orders. The plebeians began to resist. In 494 BC, they staged the first Secessio Plebis, a mass walkout. They left the city, refusing to fight in wars unless they were given representation. Rome, weakened and vulnerable, listened. In response, the patricians granted a new office, Tribune of the Plebs. These officials were chosen by the plebeians alone. They had sacred status. If anyone harmed them, it was considered a crime against the gods. Most importantly, they held the power of veto. They could stop any law or action they deemed harmful to the people. It was an extraordinary check on power. Other reforms followed. The 12 Tables, Rome's first written laws, were created around 450 BC. Carved into bronze and displayed publicly, they ensured that law could no longer be twisted in secret by the elite. Now, even the poor could point to the law and say, "Here it is. I know my rights." As internal reforms shaped society, Rome continued to fight. The Republic was surrounded by enemies and was almost always at war against Volsci, Aequi, Etruscans, and Samnites. But the wars were not chaotic. Rome had developed a system, a machine of war. Each year, the consuls raised legions of citizen soldiers. Service was both duty and privilege. Battles brought glory, spoils, and eventually, land for the veterans. Victory after victory expanded Roman control across central Italy. Still, military success sharpened tensions. Commanders gained influence. Ambitious men began to ask, what if a consul refused to give up power? One story offered a model of what a Roman leader should be. In 458 BC, Rome was under threat. The Senate called upon Lucius Comptius Cincinnatus, a retired consul who had returned to farming. He was granted emergency powers as dictator, a temporary office given only during crises. Cincinnatus accepted. He raised an army, defeated the enemy in days, and then gave up power. He returned to his plow. His humility became legend. For centuries, Roman children were told, power is not for keeping. Power is for serving. Over time, Rome refined its political system into a complex web of checks and balances. 2 consuls, elected annually, prevented absolute rule. Senators guided long-term vision. Tribunes protected the common people. Assemblies allowed citizens to vote on laws. Censors kept public morals and maintained the census. Praetors judged legal cases. Rome didn't aim for equality, but it created something rare, a system designed to limit abuse. And still, tension simmered. By the late 4th century BC, Rome had become the most powerful city in central Italy. It forged alliances, offered citizenship, and absorbed rivals. Its legions grew stronger, more disciplined. Roads began to stretch outward, the famous Via Appia, connecting Rome to the southern coast. Colonies were planted. Trade flowed. In 300 BC, disaster struck. A tribe from the north, the Gauls, swept into Rome and burned much of the city. The people fled to the hills. But even then, Rome did not fall. When the Gauls demanded ransom, the Roman general Camillus returned from exile and reportedly shouted, "We do not pay gold to barbarians. We pay steel." The Republic survived and rebuilt stronger. By now, Rome was not just a city, it was a power. But the seeds of future crisis were already being sown. Powerful generals, frustrated plebeians, wealth pouring in unevenly. Rome was growing, but its unity would be tested. Still, in these early centuries, the Republic held together, not through fear or force, but through a shared belief that no one man should rule forever. It was messy, it was flawed, but it was Rome. Let your mind drift now, past the hills of Latium, past the early Republic, into an age where Rome no longer fights just for survival, but for supremacy. It is the 3rd century BC. Across the sea lies Carthage, a mighty city in North Africa, rich, advanced, and proud. It commands trade routes, harbors, and wealth. Rome and Carthage are both growing, and soon they will collide. Thus begins one of the most legendary rivalries in ancient history, the Punic Wars. Carthage was founded by Phoenician settlers, sailors, merchants, explorers. Their empire spread across the western Mediterranean, Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, Spain. Their navy was unmatched. Rome, by contrast, was a land power. Its soldiers fought on foot, its strength lay in alliances and disciplined legions. For a time, the two powers coexisted, suspicious but distant. But the island of Sicily, a rich and strategic prize, would draw them into war. It began over a small Sicilian town, Messana. Rome intervened to protect its allies. Carthage responded. The conflict escalated. Rome, lacking a navy, built one from scratch, legend says. They found a wrecked Carthaginian ship, copied its design, and added a boarding ramp, the corvus, to turn sea battles into infantry fights. For over 20 years, the war raged, at sea, in Sicily, in North Africa. Hundreds of ships sank, tens of thousands died. At last, in 241 BC, Rome defeated the Carthaginian fleet at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. Carthage sued for peace. Rome gained Sicily, its first overseas province. The Republic had stepped beyond the Italian peninsula. But peace would not last. In the aftermath, Carthage rebuilt, especially in Spain. There, a general named Hamilcar Barca trained his young son in hatred of Rome. Years later, Hannibal would take command. He was brilliant, bold, and patient. In 218 BC, he attacked the city of Saguntum, an ally of Rome. Rome demanded justice. Carthage refused. The Second Punic War had begun. The Second Punic War, 218 Thurin, 201 BC. Hannibal made a daring choice. Instead of sailing to Italy, he would march. He led tens of thousands of troops, wore elephants and cavalry over the Alps in winter. It was a feat of legend. He lost men, animals, and supplies, but he reached Italy, and once there, he unleashed terror. He won stunning victories. At Trebia, where he used fog and surprise. At Lake Trasimene, where he ambushed Roman forces in a narrow pass, and most famously at Cannae in 216 BC, where his army of fewer numbers encircled and annihilated a much larger Roman force. It was one of the greatest tactical victories in military history. Rome lost perhaps 50,000 men in a single day. The Republic was shaken, but it did not fall. In the face of disaster, Rome did not surrender. It refused to negotiate. It raised new armies, fortified the city, and adopted a strategy of delay. Fabian tactics, named after the general Fabius Maximus, who harassed but avoided direct battle. Meanwhile, Hannibal remained in Italy for over 15 years. He hoped Rome's allies would defect. Few did. Rome's network held. Slowly, the tide turned. While Hannibal raged in Italy, a young Roman general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, took the war to Spain, then Africa. He studied Hannibal's methods, learned from his boldness. In 202 BC, Scipio met Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, near Carthage.
This time Rome won. Hannibal's elephants were repelled, his army scattered. Carthage was defeated. The war ended. Carthage lost its empire, navy, and independence in foreign policy. Rome emerged as the supreme power in the Western Mediterranean. Scipio was given a new name, Africanus. Though peace was signed, Rome did not rest. It fought in the east against Macedonia and the remnants of Alexander the Great's empire. Victory after victory brought Greece under Roman influence. Rome was no longer just a city, it was becoming an empire in all but name. Yet wealth and conquest brought new problems. Generals became celebrities. Soldiers wanted land and reward. The Senate struggled to control distant provinces. And far to the south, Carthage still stood, weak but alive. Some Romans, like Cato the Elder, believed Carthage must be destroyed. He ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the same words. Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. Eventually, Rome found a pretext for war. Carthage resisted, but Rome sent a massive force. After a brutal siege, Roman troops breached the walls, fought house to house, and burned the city to ashes. Tens of thousands were killed or enslaved. Salt was scattered over the ruins, legend says, to curse the land. Carthage was no more. By 146 BC, Rome had no rival in the Mediterranean. Greece, Spain, North Africa, they were now Roman provinces. Wealth poured in. New temples, theaters, and roads were built. Gladiatorial games grew in popularity. The Republic seemed invincible. But deep within, cracks had begun to form. The Punic Wars had changed Rome, not just in power, but in soul. The old virtues of simplicity and civic duty gave way to ambition, greed, and inequality. A new kind of war loomed, not against foreign enemies, but within the heart of Rome itself. The legions had conquered and Rome had grown rich, but wealth as always came unevenly. In the countryside, small farmers, the backbone of the Republic, returned from war to find their land taken by the wealthy. Vast estates, or latifundia, worked by slaves, had replaced traditional family farms. In the city, the poor flooded into Rome, hungry and jobless. The Senate, dominated by the elite, grew blind to their plight. The Republic, victorious abroad, was beginning to rot from within. Then two brothers rose from the heart of Rome with a single question. Could justice save the Republic? In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus stood before the Roman people. He was young, well-educated, and from a noble family. His grandfather was Scipio Africanus, the hero of the Punic Wars. But Tiberius did not speak for the powerful. He spoke for the poor. He proposed a land reform law to limit how much land one person could own and redistribute excess land to the poor. It was not a new idea. The laws had existed on paper for centuries, but they had been ignored. Now, Tiberius wanted to enforce them. The Senate was outraged. Many senators had become wealthy from seized land. They saw Tiberius as dangerous, not just for his ideas, but for how he acted. He bypassed the Senate entirely, bringing the law directly to the assembly of the people. He had a fellow tribune removed when he tried to block the vote. He acted not as a guardian of tradition, but as a reformer with urgency. The law passed, but the Senate struck back. When Tiberius sought re-election as tribune, a rare and provocative move, his opponents claimed he aimed to make himself king. Violence erupted. On election day, a mob of senators and their allies clubbed Tiberius to death in the Forum. Over 300 of his supporters died with him. It was the first bloodshed in Roman politics in centuries. 10 years later, in 123 BC, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, stepped into the same office, tribune of the plebs. But Gaius had learned from his brother's fate. He was sharper, more eloquent, and more strategic, and his vision went beyond land. He introduced sweeping reforms. Land redistribution was revived. Grain subsidies were offered to the poor. Judges were drawn from the equestrian class, not just senators. Roads and colonies were built, offering jobs and new lands. And Roman citizenship was proposed for Italian allies, still second class within the Republic. He built a movement, but he also built enemies. In 121 BC, tensions boiled. A consul named Lucius Opimius was given Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an emergency decree allowing any means to protect the state. Violence returned to Rome. Armed forces clashed with Gaius's supporters. He fled to the Aventine Hill and, facing certain execution, chose suicide. Over 3,000 of his allies were hunted down and killed. Gaius was gone, but the Republic had changed forever. The Gracchi brothers had tried to revive the Republic by reforming it. They believed Rome could still serve all its citizens, not just the elite. But their deaths revealed a darker truth: the Senate would kill to preserve its power, and the people, once awakened, would not forget. Future leaders watched and learned. Some would follow the Gracchi's path. Others would use their methods for ambition, not justice. Rome had crossed a threshold from debate to violence, from tradition to unrest. The Republic still stood, but its foundations were beginning to shake. The Republic had survived Carthage. It had weathered the storms of the Gracchi, but something deeper had begun to shift. A transformation not of borders or laws, but of power itself. Where once Rome was ruled by institutions, now it began to follow men. And two men, in particular, would lead it down a path from which there was no return: Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Their struggle would not only redraw the Republic, it would test whether it could survive at all. Gaius Marius was not born into Rome's elite. He came from the small town of Arpinum, an outsider in every sense. But he was ambitious and, more importantly, capable. By the late 2nd century BC, Rome faced a crisis. In the north, barbarian tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons, were sweeping down toward Italy, crushing Roman armies. Marius was elected consul, a rare honor for a novice homo, a new man. But he didn't stop there. He was elected consul 6 more times, something unheard of in Republican history. Marius saw a flaw in Rome's military system. Until then, only property-owning citizens could serve. But Italy had too few of them left. So Marius did something radical. He opened the army to the landless poor. Now, the Roman legions were no longer citizens fighting for the Republic. They were men fighting for their general. They looked to Marius, not the Senate, for rewards, land, wealth, and protection. This change would echo through history. Marius defeated the Teutons and the Cimbri in decisive battles. He was hailed as Rome's savior. But power gained on the battlefield doesn't stay there for long. Enter Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He came from old nobility, but for years he lived in relative obscurity. Still, he was brilliant, ruthless, and fiercely ambitious. He served under Marius during the war in Numidia, helping to capture the rebel king Jugurtha, but Marius took the credit. A rivalry began, one of pride, class, and power. In 88 BC, Rome declared war on Mithridates VI, king of Pontus in Asia Minor. Sulla, now consul, was given command, but Marius, elderly but still influential, used political maneuvering to have the command transferred to himself. Sulla's reaction shocked the Republic. In defiance of all law and precedent, Sulla marched his army on Rome. No general had ever done this. The city was sacred, protected by centuries of tradition. But Sulla broke that taboo. His legions entered Rome. Opponents were killed or exiled. Marius fled. Sulla had shown that in this new republic, force could overrule politics. He then left to fight Mithridates in the east, leaving Rome smoldering, confused, and fragile. But Marius wasn't finished. While Sulla fought abroad, Marius returned from exile. In 87 BC, with allies in the Senate and troops of his own, he seized power once more. What followed was a reign of terror. Political enemies were hunted down. Bodies filled the Tiber. Marius had one, but he was old and ill. He died soon after, in 86 BC, during his 7th consulship. When Sulla returned from the east in 83 BC, Rome braced itself. Once again, he marched on the city. This time, it was civil war. Sulla's forces defeated those loyal to Marius and his faction. The final battle at the Colline Gate saw tens of thousands killed. Rome became a battlefield. Now in full control, Sulla did what no Roman had ever done. He declared himself dictator for as long as he saw fit. And then came the proscriptions. Sulla published lists of enemies of the state. Any man named could be killed on sight. His property would be seized. His heirs would be disinherited. Thousands died. Wealthy Romans profited by claiming land and treasure from the murdered. Friends betrayed friends. Fear ruled. Sulla rewrote the laws, strengthened the Senate, and tried to restore the old republic. Then, just as shockingly, he resigned. In 79 BC, he stepped down, retired to the countryside, and died a year later. He had ruled as a tyrant, then walked away. Rome still called itself a republic. It still held elections, and the Senate still met. But everyone knew power now belonged to those with legions behind them. Marius and Sulla had set the precedent. If you disagreed with the Senate, you marched. If you had enemies, you killed them. If you wanted power, you seized it. The next generation, Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, were watching closely. The Republic was bleeding, but not yet dead. It would survive a few more decades, but the struggle between populace, those who claimed to speak for the people, and optimates, the senatorial elite, would only grow fiercer. Marius gave the Roman army its new shape. Sulla gave it its new rules. And both gave Rome a lesson it could not unlearn. That, in the end, the sword could rule the Senate. The Republic was a battered house. Its walls still stood, but the roof was cracked, and fire smoldered in its foundations. After the chaos of Marius and Sulla, Rome longed for peace, but what it got instead was ambition wrapped in alliances. And standing in the center of it all were three men, Pompey, Crassus, and a rising force named Gaius Julius Caesar. Together, they would form an uneasy alliance. Together, they would change Rome forever. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known as Pompey the Great, was Rome's most celebrated general. He had risen under Sulla, fighting in Sicily and Africa as a young man. He earned his title Magnus the Great not from the Senate, but from Sulla himself. At just 24, he rode through Rome in triumph. After Sulla's death, Pompey led campaigns across the Roman world. He crushed the remnants of Marius's forces in Spain. He wiped out pirates in the Mediterranean in just 3 months. He defeated Mithridates VI in the east and reorganized the eastern provinces. He returned to Rome in triumph in 62 BC, hailed as a hero. But the Senate, suspicious of his power, delayed everything he asked for: land for his soldiers, ratification of his eastern settlements, and honors due to him. Pompey, though mighty on the battlefield, was politically isolated. And that's when Julius Caesar stepped forward. Marcus Licinius Crassus was not a general like Pompey. He was a businessman, a manipulator, and perhaps the wealthiest man in Roman history. He made his fortune buying burning houses, then selling them back after his slaves had saved them. But he also had blood on his hands. Crassus crushed Spartacus's slave revolt in 71 BC, a brutal victory that ended with 6,000 crucifixions lining the Appian Way. Like Pompey, Crassus found himself ignored by the Senate. Despite their personal rivalry, both men shared a problem: they needed political power. That too would bring them to Caesar. In 60 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar was ambitious but deeply in debt. A brilliant orator, a skilled politician, and a former praetor, Caesar saw a way forward not by opposing Pompey and Crassus, but by uniting them. He offered a deal: they would support him for consul, and in return, he would push through the laws both men desired. So was born the first triumvirate, an unofficial alliance of 3 titans. Caesar brought charm and connections with the people. Pompey brought military glory and legions. Crassus brought money and influence. Together, they ruled the Republic in all but name. Caesar was elected consul in 59 BC and wasted no time. He passed laws redistributing land to Pompey's veterans. He ensured Crassus's tax contracts were honored. He married his daughter Julia to Pompey, binding the 2 men closer together. Opposition was fierce. One senator, Cato the Younger, resisted every motion, every vote. Caesar had him dragged from the Senate. By year's end, Caesar had secured his next move: a 5-year military command in Gaul. There, far from the politics of Rome, he would write his own legend. From 58 to 50 BC, Caesar waged a brutal, brilliant war in Gaul, modern-day France, and Belgium. He conquered tribe after tribe: Helvetii, Belgae, Nervii. He crossed into Britain, a feat no Roman had done before. His commentaries, De Bello Gallico, became legendary both for their propaganda and their prose. But more than victory, Caesar gained loyalty. His legions adored him. He shared their hardships, fought beside them, and rewarded them generously. He became not just their general, but their commander in spirit. And back in Rome, this alarmed the Senate. By 54 BC, things began to unravel. Julia, Caesar's beloved daughter and Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. A bond between the 2 men was broken. In 53 BC, Crassus marched east to fight the Parthians, seeking military glory to rival Caesar. Instead, he was killed at Carrhae, his army annihilated. Now the balance was gone. 2 remained, and both knew Rome was not big enough for them both. With Caesar still in Gaul, the Senate began to drift toward Pompey, who had remained in Italy. In 52 BC, after riots in the city, Pompey was named sole consul, a sign that the Senate was no longer neutral. They demanded Caesar lay down his command and return to Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar knew the truth: without his army, he would be defenseless. He would be tried, exiled, or worse. So he made his decision. On January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar and his legions crossed the Rubicon River, the official boundary of his province. It was an act of war. As his men marched, Caesar is said to have uttered the fateful words: "Alia iacta est, the die is cast." Pompey fled south. The Senate panicked. And once again, legions decided Rome's fate: not laws, not votes, but swords and shields. The civil war had begun. By now, the Republic was a republic only in name. The old rules were broken. The old values discarded. Caesar, once a rising politician, had become a conquering warlord. Pompey, once a hero of the people, now stood as the Senate's last hope. Their clash would span continents, from Italy to Greece, from Egypt to Spain. The fate of Rome itself hung in the balance. But one thing was already certain: the Republic would not survive them both. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he crossed more than a river. He crossed into history, into legend, and into a war that would end the Roman Republic. The civil war that followed was not just a clash of armies. It was a battle for the soul of Rome. Would the Republic survive? Or would one man reshape the world in his image? As Caesar's legions advanced into Italy in 49 BC, Pompey and the Senate fled the city. They knew Caesar's army, battle-hardened, loyal, and fast, would overwhelm Rome's defenses. Pompey retreated to the east, to Greece, where he could gather support from Rome's provinces. Caesar, in turn, entered Rome without bloodshed. The city, abandoned by its leaders, welcomed him as a liberator. But he had no time to celebrate. He needed ships. He needed supplies. And above all, he needed to defeat Pompey, the only man who could challenge him. Before chasing Pompey across the sea, Caesar first turned west, to Spain. There, Pompey's legions were waiting. Caesar moved quickly, marching across Gaul and into Iberia. He told his men, "I am going to Spain to fight an army without a general. Later, I will return to fight a general without an army." In a matter of months, he had defeated the opposition and secured the western provinces. Now nothing stood between him and Pompey. In 48 BC, the decisive moment came. Caesar sailed to Greece, and near the town of Pharsalus, the two armies met. Pompey's forces outnumbered Caesar's nearly 2-1. He had cavalry, supplies, and the prestige of the Senate. But Caesar had experience, speed, and unbreakable loyalty from his men. The battle was brutal. Dust filled the air. Arrows flew. And then Caesar's legions broke through Pompey's lines. Pompey fled the field, defeated. He sailed to Egypt, seeking refuge. But there he found betrayal. When Pompey arrived on the shores of Egypt, he expected hospitality. After all, he had once helped restore Egypt's king to the throne. But Egypt's new ruler, Ptolemy XIII, just a boy, saw things differently. He wanted to please Caesar. So, as Pompey stepped ashore, he was stabbed to death by former allies. When Caesar arrived days later, he was presented with Pompey's head. He wept, not just for the man, but for what Rome had become. In the chaos of Egypt's politics, Caesar found more than grief. He found Cleopatra. Young, charismatic, and ambitious, Cleopatra sought to reclaim her throne. Caesar helped her defeat her brother's forces and installed her as queen. The two became lovers, and she later bore him a son, Caesarion. But Rome called him back. The civil war wasn't over. Though Pompey was dead, resistance continued. In North Africa and later in Spain, Pompey's allies and sons raised new armies. Caesar fought them all swiftly, efficiently, and without mercy. At the Battle of Thapsus, 46 BC, and later at Munda, 45 BC, he crushed the last remnants of the opposition. His enemies lay dead. His power was now absolute. With his rivals gone, Caesar returned to Rome not as consul, but as dictator. At first, it was temporary. Then for 10 years. And finally, in 44 BC, dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. He passed sweeping reforms. Reorganized the calendar, creating the Julian calendar, the one we use today. Granted citizenship to people across the provinces. Expanded the Senate. Began plans for vast public works and colonization. But his power unnerved many. Rome had always feared kings. And Caesar was beginning to look like one dot on March 15, 44 BC. The Ides of March, Caesar entered the Senate chamber. He was surrounded by men he called friends. And then the daggers came out. Brutus, Cassius, and over 60 senators stabbed Caesar 23 times. As his blood spilled onto the floor, the Republic gasped, had they saved it? Or had they doomed it forever? Caesar was dead, but Rome was not at peace. Far from restoring the Republic, his assassination plunged Rome into further chaos. Riots broke out in the streets. His loyal friend Mark Antony seized power. A new figure emerged, Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted son. The murder of Caesar had not killed ambition. It had unleashed it. The next wars between Antony, Octavian, and Caesar's assassins would be even bloodier. Eventually, Octavian would emerge as Rome's first emperor, taking the name Augustus. The Republic, in name, would linger a while longer. But in truth, it had died with Caesar. The war between Caesar and Pompey was more than a political struggle. It was a turning point in world history. From it rose an empire that would shape the West. And from Caesar's ashes rose an idea that one man could hold the fate of a nation. A general, a reformer, a dictator, a martyr. Caesar's name would become a title: Caesar, Kaiser, Czar. His life, his wars, his words, his death would echo for centuries. But for Rome, there would never again be a true republic. Only emperors. After the knives fell on Caesar, the Senate believed they had saved the republic. But they had only unleashed the storm. Rome stood fractured. Its people mourned Caesar. Its armies waited. And out of the ashes stepped a youth barely 18, quiet in voice, but bound for power. His name was Gaius Octavius, and soon the world would know him as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Octavius was Caesar's grandnephew, but more importantly, he was named in Caesar's will as his adopted son and heir. When news of Caesar's death reached him in Greece, he hurried to Rome, not with legions, but with purpose. Many dismissed him. He was young, sickly, and inexperienced. But Octavian had something others didn't: Caesar's name and Caesar's wealth. He quickly began building political alliances, winning over veterans, and positioning himself as the true successor of Caesar's legacy. Meanwhile, Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted general and co-consul, believed he should inherit Caesar's mantle. He gave a fiery speech at Caesar's funeral, riling the crowd against the assassins. Rome descended into chaos. Brutus and Cassius, the chief conspirators, fled to the east. But Antony had underestimated Octavian. The young heir began gathering support not by strength, but by strategy. He courted the Senate. He played on public sympathy. And eventually, the Senate, fearing Antony's growing power, granted Octavian command. The lines were drawn. In 43 BC, Octavian, Antony, and a third figure, Lepidus, a powerful military commander, formed the Second Triumvirate. This was no secret alliance. It was legally ratified, giving the three men absolute power to make war, enact laws, and purge enemies. And purge they did. Thousands were executed. Lands were confiscated. Even Cicero, the great orator and philosopher, was killed, targeted by Antony for his criticism. Rome became a city of lists, proscription lists, where names meant death. But the true war was still to come. In 42 BC, the triumvirs marched east to face Brutus and Cassius, who had gathered armies in Macedonia. The clash came at Philippi, a thunderous, bloody battle across marshes and hills. At first, the assassins held strong. Cassius, misled by false reports, took his own life. Soon after, Brutus was defeated and also fell on his sword. The men who killed Caesar were dead. But peace did not follow. With their common enemies gone, the triumvirate began to fracture. Lepidus faded into obscurity, stripped of power. Antony turned east, allying himself with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and Caesar's former lover. Together, they had children, raised armies, and began to rule the eastern provinces like monarchs. To the Roman Senate, this looked like betrayal. Octavian, still in Rome, used it brilliantly. He launched a propaganda war, painting Antony as a traitor, seduced by a foreign queen, plotting to make Alexandria, not Rome, the center of power. The stage was set for one final showdown. In 31 BC, the forces of Octavian and Antony met at Actium, a naval battle off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was larger, but Octavian's admiral Agrippa was brilliant. As the battle raged, Cleopatra's ships fled, and Antony followed her. His fleet collapsed. His men surrendered. It was not just a defeat, it was a humiliation. A year later, in 30 BC, Octavian marched into Alexandria. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, fell on his sword. She too ended her life, legend says, by asp bite. With their deaths, Octavian stood unchallenged. Rome had been at war with itself for nearly 20 years. Octavian could have seized the throne outright, but he was patient, strategic. He returned power to the Senate but kept the real control. He accepted the title Augustus in 27 BC, meaning the revered one. He became princeps, first citizen, not king, but everyone knew what he was. He controlled the army, the treasury, the provinces. Thus was born the Roman Empire, with Augustus as its first emperor. The Republic still existed in name, but in spirit it was gone. Under Augustus, Rome entered a golden age, the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. Roads stretched from Britain to Syria. Cities rose from Africa to Gaul. Trade flourished. Art thrived. Literature soared. Augustus reformed the military, the tax system, even the morals of Roman society. He ruled for over 40 years, respected by the people, worshipped by some, feared by others. He was careful never to call himself a king, but statues of him rose in every province. His image adorned every coin. The boy who once raced to Rome on Caesar's name had become Rome itself. Augustus died in 14 AD, naming his stepson Tiberius as successor. The empire he forged would stand for over 400 years in the West and over 1,000 in the East. His impact was so profound that every future emperor would bear the title Caesar or Augustus. And long after the empire fell, his name lived on in Kaisers, Tsars, and even in the calendar we use today. Yes, August is named for him. The rise of Augustus was not just the story of a man. It was the story of Rome's transformation. From a republic of farmers and senators, it had become an empire of soldiers and emperors. The ideals of the republic, liberty, checks on power, senatorial debate, were swept away. In their place rose a new order, imperial Rome, where one man ruled and the fate of the world bent to his will. The republic had died. But in its place stood something greater, or at least more lasting. An empire that would shape the course of civilization. And it all began with a boy named Octavian.
The story of Rome is not just a tale of emperors, battles, and marble monuments. It is the story of ambition and betrayal, of freedom and tyranny, of how a city born on 7 hills conquered the known world and shaped the one to come. From Romulus to Augustus, from the Wolf's Cave to imperial palaces, Rome evolved from a kingdom to a republic, and from a republic to an empire. But even when the empire crumbled, its legacy did not die. We see it in our laws, our languages, our architecture, and our dreams of power and glory. The Senate is silent. The legions long disbanded. The emperors lie in stone. But Rome lives on, in stories, in roads, in ruins that refuse to vanish. Because Rome was not just a place, it was an idea that still echoes through time. So the next time you walk a city street, speak a Latin root, or read of justice and law, remember Rome. Remember how it rose, and how it never truly fell.